the indigenous Orang Asli of Malaysia, and invoke the blessings of their ancestors for the Asia-Pacific Climate Week and the welfare and well-being of everyone attending this event. I am Manja Bayang, an indigenous person from the Philippines. Today, I am wearing my indigenous attire in solidarity with my indigenous brothers and sisters from different countries in Asia, who, despite facing challenges in registering and traveling to Malaysia to attend this regional climate week, they are here with us to represent the voices of indigenous peoples in this platform. Indigenous peoples comprise only 5% of the world's population. 70% of these are in Asia. And despite their small number, they represent 15% of the world's extreme poor. 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity are in indigenous territories, and they manage 40% of all terrestrial protected areas and ecologically rich ecosystems worldwide. As a result of their traditional resource managements and worldviews that are centered on protection of Mother Earth for the future generation. The areas managed by indigenous peoples have also shown lower deforestation rates and lower carbon emissions. And yet, despite this, their voices remain marginalized in discussions and negotiating tables on climate change. This year at the COP28 in Dubai, governments will have the first global Stocktake, which is a key mechanism under the Paris Agreement to assess collective progress towards achieving the purpose of this agreement and its long-term goals. It means looking at everything related to where the world stands on climate action and support and identifying the gaps and working together to chart a better course forward to accelerate climate action. So throughout this week, we will be having dialogue centered on the impacts and losses related to extreme events. We will also be learning from good practices, lessons learned, and examples that stakeholders are driving forward. The first global Stocktake is expected to inform countries in updating and enhancing their climate action and support, as well as in enhancing global cooperation for climate action. This year's regional climate weeks in Africa, Latin America, and here in the Asia-Pacific region are designed to build momentum for the first global Stocktake's outcome by discussing regional priorities and needs. The experiences, knowledge systems, and values of indigenous peoples and local communities, cultivated through generations of interaction with the landscapes and seascapes, are particularly relevant in shaping a regional and ultimately global vision for an ambitious global Stocktake outcome and future direction of global climate action. This session will also consider policy signals that are necessary to emerge from the global Stocktake outcome to enhance climate action, support and collaboration in and with the region, and collect key messages from the region to be channeled into the global Stocktake high-level events with a view to shaping the outcome. We will be hearing from different speakers, and later there will be an open forum. To deliver the opening remarks for this session, I would like to introduce Professor Farouz Nadar, who is the Executive Director for the UN Global Compact Network for Malaysia and Brunei, a local network of the United Nations Global Compact. Professor Nadar is developing various strategic programs and digital tools to accelerate private sector SDG performance. He is a business sector representative to Malaysia's National SDG Steering Committee and has presented at various national and global sustainability forums. Professor, may I please invite you to the stage.
Honorable Ministers, distinguished delegates, online participants, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon to all of you. I know this is one of the toughest ones because after lunch, but I promise to try my best to be short and be sweet, right? So this year, the 4 regional climate weeks have been designed to build momentum towards the conclusion of the first global Stocktake. This grassroots exchange of knowledge and best practices can enhance our climate efforts and enable us to work towards a sustainable and resilient future for all. Today's event here at the Asia Pacific Climate Week, therefore, provides a platform to amplify regional voices towards a strong and ambitious outcome on the global Stocktake at COP28 in Dubai later this year. Together, we can assess our global response to the climate crisis and chart a better way forward. The 4 key thematic tracks that preside over today's event are each tailored to deliver region-specific insights to support the global Stocktake, the first assessment of global climate action under the Paris Agreement and set to conclude at the upcoming UN Climate Change Conference or COP28. The technical assessment phase of the first global Stocktake recently concluded, and we are now in the political outcome component phase. By examining the outcomes of the technical dialogue synthesis report, we can identify gaps, best practices, and opportunities for improvement. Under the different thematic areas of mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation, the report highlights the following. Firstly, global emissions are not in line with keeping warming to 1.5 degrees, and urgent and deep emission reductions are required across the board. There is a rapidly narrowing window of action, and we cannot delay any further. Secondly, increased and transformational adaptation actions, as well as efforts to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage are urgently needed to reduce and respond to the increasing impacts. Thirdly, availability and access to support, particularly finance, remains a prime enabler for climate action. And finally, enhancing cooperation across levels and sectors remains a priority for advancing the Paris Agreement. As we have now moved to the political phase of the global Stocktake, I invite all stakeholders to utilize this platform and deliberate on what a strong and ambitious global Stocktake outcome entails. This platform is also crucial for defining and positioning the region to implement the global Stocktake outcome by sharing experiences, lessons, and good practices. The outcome of the GST shall inform and guide the parties in updating and improving their nationally determined contributions to allow for a correction of costs, ratchet up the level of ambition, and enhance international cooperation for climate action. The Asia-Pacific region is grappling with an array of huge climate impacts, including extreme weather events, from typhoons, hurricanes, to droughts and rising sea levels. The critical need for coordinated climate action has never been pressing. Yet, the Asia-Pacific region is more than just a place dealing with huge climate challenges. It is a leading force for climate solutions. It is a natural buffer against climate-related disasters with its pristine coral reefs, coastal mangroves, forests, and diverse landscapes. The region's strong commitment to clean energy has positioned it as a leader in the global clean development, creating millions of jobs and benefiting the environment. We can and must be leaders in a common but differentiated responsibilities dialogues. Malaysia, for example, is one of the 17 mega-diverse biodiversity countries, and we are an example of how balancing economic growth and environmental responsibility is possible. For example, the Sarawak state is producing green hydrogen to power a cleaner future, not just in Malaysia, but exporting to the region, whilst improving their environmental footprint. Closer to ground, for us at the UN Global Compact, with over 3,500 participants in Asia-Pacific region and offices in 15 Asia-Pacific nations, we are the largest and most diverse business sustainability platform. We see the private sector as key stakeholders in the fight against climate change. This year, we launched our Forward Faster initiatives to commit companies to needed urgent targets and increase accountability. I would like to take this opportunity to highlight relevant climate action Forward Faster initiative targets that we will be championing for corporates and SMEs to commit towards. First is to set corporate science-based net zero emission reduction targets in line with the 1.5-degree pathway with the goal of halving global emissions by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2050 at least. Second is to contribute to a just transition by taking concrete actions that address social impacts of climate change mitigation and adaptation measures in partnerships with actors such as workers, unions, communities, and suppliers. And third is to achieve 100% of employees across the organization to earn a living wage by 2030. For me, this is very important so that everyone can afford to take actions needed to decarbonize. Let's take this opportunity today to have the needed dialogues, exchange of best practices and experiences, and contribute to this historic first global stocktake. I thank you all and wish you all fruitful deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Nadar. And indeed, urgent measures are required, and we cannot delay any longer. And together, as he said, we can have a strong voice as a region in the global stocktake. We are also honored to have 4 speakers with us this afternoon who will share with us knowledge and insights that are relevant for the region and to the global stocktake. As I introduce you, please come up to the stage and take a seat in front. The first speaker is His Excellency Nik Nasmi bin Nik Ahmad, who is the Malaysian Minister for Natural Resources, Environment, and Climate Change. His work has included focusing on the economy and finance, trade and industry, natural resources, energy, sustainable development, technology, and innovation. Is His Excellency present? If he's not, he will join us in a bit. The next speaker is Minister Grace Fu. She is the Minister for Sustainability and the Environment of Singapore. She has over 17 years in shaping policy and a passion for public service and social impact. She leads the development and implementation of policies and initiatives to enhance Singapore's environmental sustainability and resilience. Thank you, Minister Fu, for joining us in front. Please take the second, please. Our next speaker is Yin Xiaolong. He is the Deputy Director of Research at the Kasana Research Institute. He focuses on industrial policy, climate change, and future technologies. Please join us. And then our speaker, last speaker is Kiran Liner. Kiran is the co-focal point at Malaysian Youth Delegation, who is working on stakeholder engagement and identifying opportunities on green financing, adaptation, low carbon planning. Join us here. So thank you again for joining us this afternoon. I would like to ask each one of you a question in relation to the global stocktake, and we look forward to learning from your responses. Since the minister is not yet here, I will start with Minister Fu for the question for you. Since the commencement of the global stocktake process, it is well known that countries are calling for an ambitious and strong global stocktake outcome. A test of the global stocktake outcome is in actualizing or realizing its outcomes. How can countries and stakeholders demonstrate commitment post-global stocktake?
I think countries and parties, non-state parties included, should demonstrate good faith and trust in each other in this process. The global stocktake enables us to do a global, as it says, global stocktake, to really take an assessment on our global effort towards climate action. If you look at how we have done over the last 8 years since Paris Agreement, I think our earlier speaker has already mentioned that actually we have not been on course, or we have not done enough. But actually, if you look carefully, that has been actually an improvement prior to Paris Agreement. So actually we have brought the extreme scenario down a little bit, but it's not near 1.5 degrees yet. So we need to work even harder. So first thing, recognize that actually we have made progress, but also recognize that the progress that we have made is insufficient. Now, how do we collectively, globally, look at a next round of better, efforts and better, implementation. Personally, I'm very much interested in implementation because I think the days of setting targets and more targets, I think we have enough of target setting. What we really need is for all parties to really look at their targets and look at implementation, and implementation early. Again, as all of us have acknowledged and realized that actually immediate implementation this decade is actually critical to arrest global warming. So how do we do it quickly, and how do we do it, as collective, collective ideas as well as collective wisdom can get us there. So the global stocktake as a process enable all of us to share ideas, to look at what we have done well, where are the gaps, and how can we together as global community plug the gaps together. This transition is going to be really massive because we are talking about, cutting across many sectors, from energy to agriculture to mobility to built environment. Every sector that uses energy actually is involved or should be involved. So how do we find really the collective wisdom of all the industry leaders and all parties to be working together, to be working, even interministerially, intersectorally, intergovernmentally? That's really, I think, what we should do. And I'm very hopeful that the process of GST can bring us to that position, to look at collective targets post-GST. GST is going to show us some areas where there are gaps, and it's also going to bring us, best practices. So looking at best practices and also how we can plug the gaps, I think will lead us, hopefully, to better outcome for the next round of NDCs. Some of the areas that we have started to talk about is really, should we look at global targets for the renewable energy sector? Should we also look at energy efficiency improvements? And how can we look at managing our non-CO2 gases? How can we include, all sectors in the economy? How can we look at forests and agricultural use of land? How can we get better productivity out of our farms? How do we have peatland management? How do we ensure that there's better crop yield so that our farmers are more climatic resilient and also we are better protected against food price volatility? How can we make sure that there's water availability? Because we are talking about extreme weather events, and therefore as adaptation measures, how does water come into play? If there's nothing that has taught us in the last 8 years, is really that extreme weather events are happening more frequently and actually in many other places. Places where don't normally flood are beginning to see possibility of flooding. And that really should be sending us a big signal that we must look at mitigation and we must also look at adaptation seriously, because adaptation is going to help us build the resilience that we need as a global community towards global warming.
Thank you so much, Minister. And what really struck me is that what you mentioned about the importance of good faith and trust towards a genuine global stocktake. So that's, we couldn't agree more. Now to Xiaolong. The global stocktake process has continuously highlighted the importance of adequacy in support and the role of non-party stakeholders. How can the global stocktake fill the critical gaps that are existing in means of implementation and support in finance, capacity building, and technology transfer for climate action and just transition? And what is the role of the non-party stakeholders in this context?
Thank you so much for your question. Good afternoon, everybody. I think it's important just to set some context for the global stocktake, right? Because the global stocktake is just a means, it's the first step on the means towards trying to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement as well as the Mother Convention. And we want to stabilize the climate. And so far, according to the science, we're not meeting the targets, right? By early this year, scientists were already reporting that we'd exhausted half of the 500 gigaton budget to have a 50% chance at 1.5, as reported by the IPCC. Our collective progress, and I have to emphasize, it's collective progress that is going to be assessed at the GST, and not individual countries necessarily held to account. Our collective progress, I would say, from that respect, is lacking. And there are big consequences from this, and also big consequences from other policy decisions happening around the world, as quite a number of developed countries begin to re-embrace industrial policy, but also combine it with trade protectionism. And that is going to affect the private sector. And it's already affecting the private sector in the developing world. So we have to ensure, as we try and move ahead on collective climate action, we also don't destroy the economic basis on which the prosperity is needed to respond to climate, right? Because mitigation is not cheap. Adaptation is not cheap. Dealing with loss and damage is also not cheap. So I think it's very important to return to this issue of means of implementation. We really have to address the financing gap. And we need to get together to rebuild trust and move from the position of promises made, promises broken in terms of climate finance and the 100 billion target, to really promises kept and adequate promises, because 100 billion per year is not enough. It's very, very clear by now that we're talking in the order of $2 to $3 trillion US dollars per year needed for developing countries to enable a just transition by 2050. That is a big figure. And it's tremendously important for developing countries going into the GST to understand what your domestic costs are going to be for transition. Malaysia has only just begun to work these out, right? We have a national energy transition roadmap which set the energy transition figure at just I can't say just, at an incredible 1.2 trillion ringgit, right, until 2050. That's a huge amount. That's just the investment needed. That is not the financing of it, because how will that kind of transition be financed? One of the things that we're working on, the Kazana Research Institute, is to look at the true cost of climate finance, because when you have to finance a massive transition like this, it will primarily have to be financed with debt instruments. If you issue government securities, as Malaysia often does, 4% or so, we calculate that for the total transition bill for energy transition plus floods adaptation, we're looking at a combined bill of 2.1 trillion ringgit. Right? That's including the finance that we have to pay for. Where's that money going to come from? So that's why we need a very diverse set of responses from the public sector as well as private sector actors in order to bridge this kind of financing gap, because it's more than the capacity of our fiscal strength at the moment. How do we begin to engage that? How do we also prepare? But this is also going to help prepare the private sector for a more climate dangerous future, because we have to know that we're currently now at 1.1 and 1.2 degrees centigrade. And already within the last week, the Panama Canal has reduced its service by 50% due to drought. And that is one of the major gateways of world trade. On our side, I would say both Singapore and Malaysia are also trading nations. We're both dependent on our ports, but sea level rise is going to negatively affect our ability to trade. And we have even priced in how much it's going to cost to adapt to sea level rise in, say, Port Klang in Malaysia. Definitely it's going to be in the billions. How are we going to raise the money for this? What kind of debt instruments can we issue? How can we defray the cost of finance? These are tremendously important questions. It's not just for the governments to worry about, because every single company involved in export and import in Malaysia has to worry about this issue, right? A lot is at stake. That's why when we go to COP and we go to all the other meetings, that we need to have a very clear understanding of the financial implications in order that we can argue a very strong case built on our common but differentiated responsibilities for an adequately financed just transition for all of us. If we don't have a clear understanding of the financial gap and where our commitments put us, then we may be caught left high and dry. Now, it's also important as countries go into the global stocktake, while the emphasis is on collective progress, it's also important to understand the individual progress that your country has made, the level of ambition of your commitment, And in research that we're about to publish in a couple of weeks, we've looked at several countries, the US, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand within our region. We unfortunately haven't considered Singapore due to a lack of time. But we find that, say for the US, its NDC is not sufficiently ambitious, given its high capabilities and its large emissions. But for Malaysia, our NDC is actually very much within our fair share use of the atmosphere, and perhaps overly ambitious because we don't have quite the financial resources to back up a full transition. So therefore, it's very important to understand that we will need greater financial resources going into this. Likewise, Indonesia is also committed to a fair share use of the atmosphere, as has Thailand. If countries don't understand that they're already making a fair commitment, they may be pushed into raising ambition on something that's already highly ambitious or overly ambitious. Therefore, they have to ask others to match that ambition with greater ambition in terms of financing. So I think I just want to close with that means of implementation, financing, necessary tech transfers to the countries that need it, capacity building is tremendously important, and it has to be a very clear and carefully measured ask that needs to be made again and again and again until the people with the finances and the people with the means grant them to the people who lack them. That is what a just climate transition demands. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shalom, complete with figures and statistics. And indeed, there's a need to address the financing gap because, as you said, mitigation is not cheap, and certainly achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement is not cheap. Moving on, I would like to ask Kiran, as part of the young generation, the youth are the custodians of our resources in the future. What would an ambitious global stocktake entail for young people?
Right, good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me on this panel. So I'll speak on this question in two aspects. Firstly, addressing the youth stocktake, and then addressing GST's general outcomes. So the youth stocktake also falls under the GST's capacity building and knowledge transfer. So during SB 58 in Bonn this year, a youth stocktake session was carried on as an accompaniment to the first GST in order to assess the inclusion of youth in UNFCCC processes as well as climate negotiations. So one of the matters is stressed is the importance of youth involvement in decision-making processes. So there has been an increased emphasis of youth as stakeholders in the climate crisis, which is a good thing. So for Malaysia itself, I have observed an improvement in outreach by the ministry, so such as the inclusion of youth and civil society voices in the climate change consultative panel. But of course, I'm only speaking from the perspective of a Malaysian youth CSO perspective, and even then, I'm only one voice among all of my peers. I know that this situation may not necessarily reflect those of other countries, where youth involvement still has a way to go in order to ensure proper inclusivity and empowerment. So aside from that, I also want to stress the involvement of youth, not just under the capacity of youth, but also in their personal and professional expertise, which is where the capacity building aspect comes in. So another point made during the youth stocktake session that I want to highlight is on enhancing support for young people so that they can meaningfully engage in the UNFCCC processes. So, you know, these days, all of our youth, they have grown up with first-hand experience of climate change, which its hard-hitting impacts have only grown in occurrence over the years. So whether it be the transboundary haze that all of us have faced on a near-annual basis, or the floods, say, in Johor that Her Majesty Permaisuri Queen and the Chief Minister of Johor had previously recounted that happened in March earlier this year. So, you know, if we are going to bolster our whole-of-nation approach towards the climate crisis, we need an approach that not only involves youths in the processes which impacts them, but it also provides them the technical capabilities that allows them to meaningfully conceptualize future solutions. So this leads me into the wider implications of the GST's outcomes for youth. So Southeast Asia, as a developing nation and a global South nation, faces disproportionate effects of climate change. In my view, the GST's Technical Dialogue and Synthesis Report concretely tells us what advocates from these parts of the world have already been voicing out throughout the years. So that while we are making progress towards the Paris Agreement, our NDC goals are either far less ambitious than they should be in order to achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal, or the goalpost is constantly set further back, despite bearing the knowledge and the abilities to execute upon them. There is the issue of climate finance, climate mitigation, adaptation, loss, and damage, how there is a need to further conceptualize these matters and to also scale up the allocations for them in the form of grants. So the aforementioned capacity building and knowledge transfer, especially for vulnerable communities and youth. And finally, an approach that recognizes intergenerational equity, the common but differentiated responsibilities that are enshrined within the UNFCCC, an outcome that not only acknowledges that, but also the historical and colonial impacts certain countries face in the fight against climate change. So how countries move forward after the first GST is heavily reliant on governance and political will, especially seeing that COP28 will be consideration of outputs that will impact how we move forward with the hard data and evidence that we now have on hand. All this to say that an ambitious GST outcome puts you front and center in the cause of pushing for a just and equitable solution for all. It's one that truly conceptualizes the progress of our global climate action and moves forward with meaningful commitment from governance. It cannot be just another report that we have produced and proceed to ignore the magnitude of, which would equate to negligence. So as for the meaningful inclusion of youth, the youth stocktake is only a very small component of GST. What youth need is not just a seat at the table, but also the know-how of the technical processes that go into the conceptualization of the GST and all of its components so that we have a developed understanding of it and we can play a part in holding the world accountable from our own perspective. So we deserve to have a meaningful piece in the consideration of outputs. So at the end of it, this is the future that youths are inheriting. And if the past few years have taught us anything about the youth climate movement, is that we are more than willing to champion for what's right. We are actively stepping into the future that this milestone GST has paved. It's very much our responsibility from here on out to apply ourselves, but it's also the responsibilities of the other stakeholders around us, be it government, corporations, and businesses, in order to capitalize on youth strengths and properly mobilize efforts towards effective climate solutions.
Thank you so much, Kiran. And indeed, the voices of the younger generation, as the future stewards of this earth, must have a space and a meaningful engagement in all debates and negotiations on climate change. So we have heard from our three speakers, and I would like to invite anyone in the room who might have a question to our speakers or who would want to make a comment, so to please stand up and do so. We have, is it 2 microphones on the floor, stations, and somewhere in the middle. Can you please identify where the microphones are? Those who would like to make an intervention or a question, you can fall in line behind those microphones. And when you make a question or intervention, please introduce yourself. Identify the speaker who you would want to respond to this question, and please make it as brief as possible. So we already have one on this side. Yes, sir, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rizky Maulana Rahman. My questions will be to the ministers and our panelists from the Research Institute as well. So, ministers, we already knew that a lot of technical assistance are needed for developing countries, and then there is also some fundings that, in terms of loss and damage, some of developed country parties are backing off or reducing their assistance toward the developing countries. How we, the Asia Pacific regions, which is mostly consisted of the developing countries, to raise our voices to demand that the climate justice, especially to us, better assistance, loss and damage for adaptations could be happening, and especially in 2025 there will be the new quantitative goal on funding itself. How those needs can be reflected, and we as the developing countries can, ask the developed countries to take accountable for giving an assistance for that. And then I take note that coming from the second speakers talking about that some countries are doing ambitious enough, some countries is not ambitious enough. How can we as a region, talk about those individualities of NDC. So we don't have to always ask more ambitious, but as Minister said, that it's towards the implementations. Thank you very much. That's the 2 points coming from me.
Okay, thank you so much. Is there any other question? We can take 2 to 3 questions before we ask the speakers to respond. Yeah, there's one more there. And you can be next. If you can please fall in line behind the microphone.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. So my name is Dafa, and I'm a youth advocate from Plan International. So it's really interesting to hearing from the Malaysia youth delegations about youth engagement and empowerment. But I think there is one thing that I'm really concerned about. So we have been following a lot of conversation in climate conversations, either at COP or SBs, but what are the possible way for youth to really engage and being empowered to climate conversations? Because we know that we need, of course, enhancing the capacity of youth itself, but what are the concrete way that government can do about that for youth in all over the country, like in all over the world? So that's my question. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. One question before we ask the speakers to respond, and then take another set of questions later on. Yes, please, ma'am. Madam.
Sorry. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pasang Dolma Sherpa. I work for Center for Indigenous Peoples Research and Development based in Kathmandu, Nepal. I myself represent indigenous people from the Mountain Everest region, Sherpa indigenous groups from Nepal. My question goes to all the panelists, especially, and thank you so much for your excellent presentations and for your emphasis on the collective efforts and also the wisdom of transformation in the intergenerational approach. As you all are aware, that the indigenous knowledge and cultural values are really, really important. That shows from our own ground level experience, but also from the different study, including the IPCC report, 6th assessment report, that indigenous knowledge and cultural values as a basis foundation for climate resilience and the future solution to deal with the climate crisis. Considering this one, how your countries, how your organization, how your personal and collective efforts in each countries and in the regions for ensuring for protection, promotion, continuation, and also recognition of indigenous knowledge and cultural values and practices to be transferred to the young generation so that we'll have a balanced world. And especially, we understand from our own practical ground level experience, there's two need of the will, especially for recognition of our values and practices and indigenous knowledge, academic recognition, as well as the political will. So in the academic institution, most of the time, the indigenous youth and most of our young generation are still following the Western modern education, where a little is space for indigenous knowledge and values. So how you foresee this one, dealing with the academic recognition of indigenous knowledge and political will? Most of the forest regime and land regimes is still continuation of the same theme of, separating indigenous people from their lands and resources. How we deal with these challenges faced by indigenous knowledge when we are away from our lands and resources in the name of protected area, in the different conservation, in different forest regimes, that has inviting further vulnerability for survival of our identity and our knowledge system. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Pasang. So we'll have responses from our speakers before taking the next set of questions. We'll start with Xiaolong.
Thank you for your questions. I'll take the last one first. On the issue of indigenous peoples, I think it's particularly they can play a particularly important role in discussions around adaptation measures, because adaptation, as we know, is local and highly context specific. And it's very important that local knowledge filters upwards to inform what can be considered to be more regional or even national adaptation measures. And consultation with communities is particularly important for that. I say this as also someone who used to work in a state office that was responsible for gazetting and protecting indigenous land. It's very important to protect the basis of indigenous wealth, which is often tied to the land, as well as socioeconomic empowerment. I think we need to recognize that a number of indigenous communities are vulnerable because they're living in coastal areas, and sea level rise will be a major threat, not only to their land, but also to their way of life. We can point to the Mameri or Ashley in Selangor, who live in the Port Klang area. Their mangroves are also the source of a very important kind of wood, which they use for their traditional carvings. So there's a lot of intangible heritage that stands to be at risk. This also factors into loss and damage calculations as well. So it's very important as countries go forward to try and represent what the bills or the damages could be, is to also consider the impact to indigenous peoples, but also first and foremost to protect and to ensure that they have some kind of climate security going ahead. Secondly, I'll go back to the first question, which was talking about the region. And if I try and understand it correctly, is how do we appropriately shape ambition and engage with implementation? I think it's important to understand what the bigger picture of financial impacts are. If we look at research produced by the Swiss Re Institute, which is associated with the insurance industry, they have projected for ASEAN as a whole to lose 47% of its GDP by 2048 under a business as usual case if no climate action is taken and we hit 3.2 degrees warming. 47%. Malaysia is only slightly behind the regional average at minus 46% GDP loss. It's very sobering, and we have to do everything we can to prevent that, because that would mean the destruction, basically, of decades of socioeconomic development that we've planned for in our country or countries. At the same time, shaping the asks for climate finance to step into the trillions of dollars is not unreasonable, because scholars have also found out or determined that the net wealth transfers going from the global south to the global north over the many decades from colonialism and so forth amount to about $2.2 trillion per year. And all we're asking is that favor to be returned for the next coming decades of the 21st century of at least $2 to $3 trillion per year for climate financing. I think that is only fair, and that is a reasonable ask given the wealth transfers that have resulted. At the same time, if you look at the prospective implementation of carbon border adjustment mechanisms by several countries around the world, UN agencies such as UNCTAD have found that it will basically result in net transfers of wealth from developing countries to developed countries, but at least in the case of one country implementing a CBAM, it's only going to result in 0.1% reduction in global in greenhouse gas emissions. Very negligible impact for a large and negative financial impact on development. So I think armed with these kinds of figures, armed with these kinds of studies, we can shape a very kind of concrete ask that will also give us the means of implementation and also appropriately shape ambition in a fair and just way consistent with common but differentiated responsibilities.
Thank you so much. Minister Fu?
Thank you very much. I'll also start with the third question from our friend from Nepal. I'm speaking this with really humility, that because in Singapore we are highly urbanized, we are a state economy, so we don't have the same issues with indigenous people, so to speak. So if I'm saying things that may not show understanding of your community's needs, I really need to understand you more, I must say. So I think this is what COP can do to really allow as a platform for indigenous communities to basically express themselves as to their needs, their wants, expectations, their disappointments. And I think this is a great gathering, a platform for different youth from indigenous groups to have that exchange. Because as I've been telling my own youth back home, that just because we live in a certain way, we have a certain lens about the world, how the world works, it doesn't mean that the world works as the way that we see it. each of us have our own lenses, and our lenses may not be the same. So COP UNFCCC has that really effective platform for that exchange to take place. And I'm really encouraging my own youth in Singapore to have that opportunity to get to know the youth from Nepal, to get the youth from Malaysia, Indonesia, from South America, to know them better, so that when we discuss world problem, we have a more rounded understanding of the needs and wants. And I'm sure the needs and wants and expectations of the indigenous communities are not the same. Some indigenous groups may want electricity. If so, then the question is, in what form? They may want clean water. And if so, in what form? They may want good jobs. Again, how should we organize it for them? So different societies will have to find its own way of development and to have that development inclusive of their own indigenous people. So I think youth at UNFCCC and also many of our non-state parties are doing a wonderful job of getting their voices heard. So back to, I think I've addressed number 2 about youth engagement. The third part, which is really what I think Mr. Rahmav has asked, right? How do we have a discussion about, financing, especially if you think about climate injustice? I think it's important for Global Stocktake to acknowledge that certain commitments, promises that were made, have to be implemented in order to, support Paris Agreement. So I think that's an important part of Global Stocktake, is really to look at what has been promised and also to date, what has been done, what has not been done, and then to take note of where there's gaps, right? So it's important for us to have that conversation, also important for developed countries to live up to the expectations, which is really to come in and support developing countries with finance. But I would also want to maybe suggest that actually in the arena of finance, climate finance, in broader terms, looking beyond grants, looking beyond donations, there are actually new ways of financing climate finance. I think we just talked about, how, there are new deals that are being, signed today about, going into renewable energy, going into mobility on EV. These are areas, particularly in the mitigation area, that has new way of financing, because instead of financing, say, a coal-fired power plant, can we jump and leapfrog to a renewable energy power plant? And if so, would that be financing for that? I'm sure there's enough bankers out there that will consider this a good way to decarbonize their own bank portfolio. The question is, how do we get that to developing countries, given some of the considerations about exchange risks, about country risks, about policy risks? This is where we need to get other parties involved, such as MDBs, such as some of our IFIs, to come in and underwrite. We are working very hard, Singapore, to look at some blended finance model that could work, that could help bring in financing sources from the private sectors, so that we can fund the trillions that my fellow panelists have talked about. This is what the world needs. We cannot, the trillions cannot be financed through just grants and donations. It's somewhere that the money is there, but is resting in private sector, is resting with investors, is resting with banks, for example. So we need to find some way to find a new model to finance that. In adaptation, typically, it's harder to finance because you're talking about reclaiming or having a seawall. It's harder to get banks or investors to invest in them. But that's not necessarily the case for all types of adaptation measures. I would just take agriculture as an example. We all know that agriculture is being affected by climate change because rain is getting more unpredictable. And actually, agriculture is also a source of greenhouse gas. So it's both a cause of global warming and a victim of it, right? So if there are solutions that can help us farm better in a more sustainable way, in a more productive way, in a more climate resilient way, so that our farmers are assured of production, higher production, and have a better lives, instead of being subjected to the vagaries of weather patterns, they are able to farm in a more climate resilient way because of technology, because of better seed varieties. Then I think we can really find a solution that can be scaled. And this is where I think, again, new sources of financing with technology, with partnerships from some of the organizations that's just listed here, or on this left-hand side, UNEP, UNDP. This is where I think if all parties, given their different sort of terms of reference, their different objectives. Somebody must have objected to what I said. But if we are able to get together, this is where I think partnership is so important. So back to the first question, what do we need after GST? Really is about partnership. Really is to get beyond looking at, protectionistic measures, looking at geopolitical tension. Look beyond that and to really find solutions that work. And Singapore wants to do that. We want to find solutions. Of course, we are a very small country, but if we can find some solutions that can work in some way, and if we can help to promote that idea, that model, so that the model can be scaled, I think that's useful for others as well. So we are very keen to have partners with us, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in water, whether it's in energy, whether it's in green technology like hydrogen or carbon capture, because we believe that this is a problem that no one single party, no one single country can solve alone. And we must work together to really find new solutions, new sources of finance, new topic of engagement, so that, we have to find what is good for your country. Because, as I say, even indigenous community, they are not the same. So how do we find solutions that are suitable, that is adaptable to you? It's really important. And let me just one last suggestion. One of the example of carbon credits that I have come across is really happening in Peru. Fishing community along the coast, suffering from, sort of impact of either climate or overfishing. The fishing community is having to go further and further out into the sea to get their catch. And the carbon credit project actually brings resources to plant seagrass. So what the seagrass does is a carbon sequestration. You actually have seagrass planted in hectares and hectares of the coast along this community. And with that, carbon credits come in, couple of $1 million to have that planted. That's actually livelihood for the local communities to plant those seagrass. The seagrass sequests carbon dioxide, it helps with the mitigation as carbon sink, and rehabilitates the ocean. So actually it's promoting a new ecosystem for the fish. So actually you find a local community able to benefit from fishery again after rehabilitation. So I see this really as a win-win-win, kind of good for the environment, good for the fishermen, good for the local community, good for the person that's buying carbon credits. So is there something that is suitable for your community? I don't know. So who can make that accessible? The youth that are attending COP, that are out there, please don't just stay in the area with the youth, but go out there to talk to the people that's doing finance, to talk to the people that are doing industry, to talk to the people that's in, academia. Find out what's happening, what are the new technology, what are the new way of financing, and bring that back to your own community. That's how you can be an effective bridge, because nobody knows your community better than you do. So if you can find what's appropriate to benefit your community, I think that the trip to COP, it's really going to be worth many, many times over. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. And can we have Kiran?
Thank you. So I think I'll be mainly addressing the question regarding youth engagement. So I am quite in agreement with Her Excellency on the matter of finding your own community. I think I'll speak a little bit on finding sort of your own personal advocacy first, before moving on to how you can sort of engage with the government. So I think on a personal level, like finding your niche within advocacy is really important, because I think maybe from a lot of young people, there's still an idea that to get into climate action, there's still a need for you to have a science background, for instance. But when we talk about a whole of nation approach, it really does mean a whole of nation approach. You don't necessarily need a science background to do so. I myself don't come from a science background. I found my niche in my organization, Malaysian Youth Delegation. We focus on climate policy, so that's sort of my area of interest. And there are all kinds of volunteer organizations out there that cover various areas. So if you have interest in media, you can look into social media advocacy, for instance. If you have an interest in zero waste, that can lead into waste management. So there's sort of all kinds of areas of advocacy that you can find your specific interest and passion in, and just really hone in on what can be improved there and what you really, really want to achieve there. Because from sort of finding your own niche and your own community, you find your own community and you sort of build a network from there, because you meet people who have years of experience more than you, who are more familiar with that field with you, either by means of volunteerism or on a professional level. And you build your networks from there, and inevitably, there's overlaps in all of the areas that we're working with. And there's inevitably someone who has worked with the government before and who can sort of tell you about how your cause aligns or overlaps with the government and what sort of things you can do from there. So I think everyone's youth advocacy situation is very different. I think we took a lot of time to sort of build rapport with our own Ministry of Environment over the years in order to effectively engage with them. So I know like when we talk about government providing capacity building, that's sort of a very vague thing, because capacity building can mean a lot of things. So I think that's sort of where the network part comes into handy, because like I said, you can sort of identify what's still missing and what you specifically want to request for the government to sort of listen to your cause and address your cause and sort of help you build up upon your cause. So I think most vitally, of course, is that if we have a platform for the government to listen to us, I think that's the most direct and most effective way, because as I was mentioning before, most of us sort of already have an idea of what we want to achieve. We just really need the platform for people to be listening to us. And I think maybe just aside from that, and also sort of the general connection building that we can do, I think the government can definitely provide more opportunities for youth development, for like green careers, for instance. Like, I was saying, a lot of us are really unfamiliar with how we can sort of contribute in our own ways to the climate action. So, building capacity in terms of technical expertise and maybe biodiversity, or maybe even fields like corporate and ESG, I think would be a really good way to do so. And I think ultimately also, when we come back to community, just having a really unified front with all of your peers and your friends is really important, because then you have a focused idea on what you're demanding for. And the more unified you are, then the more you sort of know what you're asking for, and the louder you can be about it, and then there will be people who can listen to you and move forward with you from there. So that's my perspective on the matter. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. As we're running out of time, there are 3 people on the mic. May I request that you be direct and brief in your questions or intervention? Yes, please go ahead.
Hello. So, hi, my name is Diana. I'm orang asli belong to Jakom tribe. So, I will speak in Malay, so someone need to help to translate. So, soalan ni ditujukan kepada wakil belia lah. Seperti yang saya dengar tadi, Malaysia banyak melibatkan wakil belia untuk dalam isu perubahan iklim. Jadi bolehkah sebut apakah jenis platform seperti beliau, saya orang asli, dan apakah platform seperti orang asal yang boleh menyumbang juga suara mereka, sebab isu perubahan iklim, krisis iklim ni adalah peringkat global. So macam mana kami wakil orang asli di komuniti nak pergi ke COP, sedangkan yang tak ada wakil orang asli yang boleh pergi ke peringkat global. So apakah usaha kerajaan Malaysia untuk menghantar lebih ramai lagi orang asli lah?
Okay, thank you. Can somebody quickly translate that to English? And then we can have the next question, and then can have the translation after.
Saya bercakap di dalam bahasa Malaysia. Ya. Saya Fatimah, anak perempuan Basin. Saya terus kepada soalan saja. Kami orang asli di Malaysia tidak tahu apa itu perubahan iklim. Jadi pihak kerajaan sebelum membuat kata putus tentang perubahan iklim, sepatutnya harus memberitahu kepada masyarakat orang asli apa itu perubahan iklim. Sebabnya perubahan iklim ni banyak berlakunya kepada kawasan wilayah tanah adat kami orang asli. Nombor 2, apa saya cakap macam tu, tempat wilayah kami habis dimusnah, diambil, hak kami tidak diiktiraf. Jadi saya harap sebelum kerajaan membuat kata putus sesuatu, kerajaan harus berbincang. Jangan buat kajian tetapi kajian itu tidak menepati apa kehendak orang asli. Kajiannya harus pergi berjumpa akar umbi orang asli, bukan hanya kepada ketua orang asli iaitu Tok Batin dan Jakwa. Saya haraplah kepada kerajaan Malaysia sebelum membuat kata putus perubahan iklim.
Okay, so those are the last 2 questions, no? Can we have the translation now?
Okay, I try my best. I'm not a professional interpreter, but the second question basically touched on how the indigenous peoples, especially the Orang Asli, don't have enough information and knowledge about climate change. And she urged that the government, before making a decision, they need to give information, full information to the indigenous people, because the effect is very much felt, because the indigenous people are at the forefront of climate change effects. She also touches on how the rights of indigenous peoples are not recognized, not respected, and many research has been done, but it doesn't address, it doesn't give a good view on the community's situation. And also she mentioned that if the government wants to do any research, don't just connect with the leaders, but also the whole of the community. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. We are running out of time.
Can I translate the first question first?
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah. So, as Diana said, she is a youth from the Jakun tribe, and she asked, how can the youth, especially the Orang Asli youth, be involved in the global stocktake when they don't even have access to go to COP? That is the main question. And she asked, is there any initiatives from the government to support more Orang Asli youth to be able to go all on these international platforms? And the fact that today we don't even have translation is also very concerning.
Okay, thank you very much. And since I asked them to be very brief in their questions, I'd ask to also for a very brief response, whoever would want to respond, if there's any response, or any last parting message from each one of you. Yes, yeah. And parting message from each one of you, if you don't have any response to that.
Maybe I'll respond.
Briefly.
You're doing excellently well. You're airing this here in a platform that's organized for climate. Congratulations. And I think it's important for us. Your ministry folks are here. I'm sure that they will take note. And I think I'll just encourage you to continue to be engaged and continue to be present. I would say that it's not easy to get every community represented at COP. I know that even for Singapore, a very small country, we have to reject a lot of youth who wants to go. But I'm sure we will think about how to do youth engagement better. And I'm sure your ministry, your respective officials will take your suggestions into consideration, right? Anyone from NRECC?
Okay, thank you for that. Xiaolong?
Okay, selamat petang dan terima kasih atas soalan yang dilontarkan tadi. Saya menyambut baik soalan yang disampaikan oleh dua wakil orang asli. Saya ingin jelaskan, saya bukan wakil kerajaan, saya bagi kongsikan pendirian peribadi. Tapi dalam pengalaman saya mula sertai proses perubahan iklim di COP 23 tahun dulu, ya, sebagai wakil masyarakat sivil. Dan antara orang pertama yang saya kenali di COP 6 adalah wakil orang asli daripada Amerika Utara, ya, Red Indian, dia kata. Dan dia sempat mewakili diri ke sana sebab dalam proses perubahan iklim di Pertubuhan Bangsa-Bangsa Bersatu adalah ruang khas untuk orang asal dunia berlainan asing daripada NGO masyarakat sivil. Jadi ada peluang khas untuk orang asal, orang asli semua untuk menyampaikan suara kebimbangan kepada proses itu. Tapi isunya dana dan sokongan untuk melawat dan menyertai dalam proses itu. Antara cabarannya, saya rasa wakil orang asli boleh berhubung dengan pihak masyarakat sivil ataupun penyumbang dana yang lain ataupun kerajaan untuk mewakili diri dan membagikan isu orang asal ke arena PBB khasnya untuk perubahan iklim. Ya, terima kasih. I'll just share that. Within the COP process is very special, along with all the other ECOSOC processes within the UN, in that indigenous peoples are a special stakeholder group. Ya, orang asal adalah pemegang taruh yang khas dalam proses perubahan iklim. So indigenous people have a special say, separate from NGOs. Within that kind of process, and hopefully indigenous peoples here and elsewhere can also speak to funders, to other members of civil society, as well as to the governments for support to go and share their views at the COP process. And yes, it is possible and it can be done.
Okay, thank you. And I hope it's also the same in the regional climate weeks. You have a parting word, Kiran, or very briefly?
Yeah, just very briefly, I think I also personally cannot speak for the government. I can only speak from my personal perspective. I do think like the platform that we sort of have is a privilege in itself, and if there's any way that we could potentially collaborate with Orang Asli and Orang Asal groups to bring your voices, to help you guys elevate your voices, I think we'd be more than happy to do so. So I think that's the only comment that I can give.
Thank you. And we also have a message from Cecilia Kinuthia Njenga, the Intergovernmental Support and Collective Progress Director of the UNFCCC. May we play first for the message of
serve as a platform to advance partnerships, cooperation, and share actionable good practices for climate action. With these remarks, on behalf of the UNFCCC, I would really like to thank you all and to wish you fruitful exchanges during this week's regional climate weeks there in Malaysia. Thank you very much and best wishes.
Thank you so much, Madam Cecilia. And from these discussions, I'd like to share at least 4 key takeaways from our discussion this afternoon. The first one, achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement is not cheap, and there's a need to address the climate finance gap. Producing dollars is not unrealistic. We just need good faith and trust towards a collective action to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, and there is a need to channel this finance to where it will have the most impact. Second, the voices of the youth must be heard. A meaningful engagement of the youth in climate change debates must always be supported, and to achieve this, there is a need to build their capacity to be able to engage and claim their space in all climate change platforms. Third, the role of indigenous peoples as stewards of huge areas of the world's biodiversity, their traditional knowledge on resource management, sustainable livelihoods and agriculture, should at all times be underscored when we are talking about climate change adaptation and mitigation. Consequently, their voices must be ensured in climate change debates and negotiations, not just in the international level, but as well in the regional and national levels. And lastly, collective action is needed. The climate crisis cannot be solved by one person alone or an individual or group of few. Every one of us has a role, and together we can achieve our common goal. We hope that these are included in the region's priorities and included in the contribution to the global Stocktake. Thank you again to our distinguished speakers and everyone who participated in this interesting discussion. And here's wishing everyone a fruitful and successful Asia-Pacific Climate Week. Thank you so much.